good morning. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. I see the number of people is rising up in the participants. I'm really glad. Okay, I would like to start by introducing myself. My name is Alizé Larguier and I work at Equality. And I have, oh, that's good. And today I have the greatest pleasure of being your host for this workshop. I would like to thank our speaker for participating in this workshop to share with us their expertise, their thoughts, and to create a discussion around the very topic of this workshop, which is Equality Bodies tackling racism and discrimination against people of African descent. Indeed, this topic is eminently important as there has been proven disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on racial and ethnic minorities, and as well shocking revelations of police brutalities against racialized communities, especially people of African descent. Therefore, our objectives today for this workshop is to zoom in on the particular expressions of racism experienced by people of African descent in European societies, and to look at the existing obstacles, to look at the solutions and the responses that can be provided by equality bodies while also cooperating with CSOs. So before we start, I would like to remind some housekeeping rules that we like to implement at Equinet. Yes, a PowerPoint is here, wonderful. So yes, indeed, we strive to keep a safer space. So as you can read on your screen on this wonderful slide, all participants should respect the safer space policy, which means engaging respectfully and peacefully with each other, using an inclusive language, respecting people's identities and pronouns, being mindful of group dynamics, and ask for consent before sharing anything, especially on social media, and also sharing responsibility to look out for each other. So we count on you to honor this safer space policy. Then some conference rules and guidelines for Zoom. Please rename yourself with your name, your organization, and the pronouns you like to use. Then, as you should know, we are going to have a Q&A for each session, and you can ask your questions for the Q&A through a dedicated chat, and it's for our speakers. And last but not least, we're going to have a little icebreaker that you're going to be able to see on your screen very soon. Yes, you can click on the link that's in the chat and answer the questions you're going to see, and then we're going to be sharing it on screen just to start us off on this beautiful Monday morning. So the question for those who are already there is, what do you see outside your windows? Okay, we already have answers. So we have trees, blue sky. Good weather is always good news. Oh, we have others without other answers that are showing up. Oh, that's a lot. Buildings, my garden, rain. Oh, that's a bummer. The sun is shining. Okay, well, that's really good. Outside of my screen, there's nothing but my offices. Rooftops and blue sky. Oh, some of you have snow. Oh, that's great. Okay. Well, one participant is still typing, but I think we are good for this icebreaker. Glad to see and hear a little bit about everyone. So now we can start. Today we are welcoming 6 speakers divided in 3 different sessions. The first session will aim to introduce the importance of intersectionality and provide an overview of the expressions of racism against people of African descent. Then the second session will overview the European and international frameworks and policy tools covering racism and discrimination against people of African descent. Then we will dive into a session on visibility, which will aim to zoom in on the expressions of racism experienced by people of African descent and the work of equality bodies responding to that. So for our first session, our first speaker is Mr. Mamadou Malcolm Jallow. He is a member of the Swedish Parliament and the General Reporter for the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe on combating racism and intolerance in Europe. He is an expert on race relations, human rights, and a regular commentator on issues affecting people of African descent. Mamadou, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I hope you can hear me loud and clear. First of all, let me just thank Equinet for this brilliant event and for inviting me to say a few words on the topic of discussion today. As I don't have a lot of time, I'm just going to get started. My talk today, introduction, is going to be based on a brilliant scholar's analysis of structural racism, amongst others, called 3CROs. And as we all have witnessed how the intersection between Black Lives Matter movement and the corona pandemic crisis has revealed the existence of structural systemic racism in European institutions, we are very aware of the impact of these structures when it comes towards Black people, people of African descent. Structures that have been shaped by centuries of oppression against people of African descent, and it's still having an impact on racialized groups today, especially people of African descent, especially if you're a Black, Muslim woman, migrant. The intersections of these identities makes it extremely difficult to be able to live a dignified life in European society today. Structures that target people of African descent at all levels and influence consciously and unconsciously a variety of policies at domestic and international level. Afrophobia, anti-Black racism, it kills, it takes people's lives, whether through violence at the hands of extremists in Europe or through the deprivation of socioeconomic rights, or through migration policies allowing European countries to profile, detain, and deport Black people to danger, as shown by the ongoing enslavement and torture of Black people in Libya. So it affects every aspect of our lives, our jobs, employment, education, criminal justice, housing, mental health, insurance, access to insurance, access to bank loans, and so on and so on. All these sectors have significant forms of structural racism and evidence of racial disparity. So we can, however, not even begin to comprehend structural racism without understanding the so-called colorblind ideology that has become a somewhat dominating counter-narrative to structural racism in Western society today. There has been an explicit ideological battle between the story of structural racism and the emergence and now dominant story of colorblindness that we see in most of the European countries today, including mine in Sweden. Allow me to make an attempt to provide you some kind of a context by talking about the definition of structural racism, at least one of the definitions. It is seen as the normalization and legitimization of a series of dynamics, historical, institutional, cultural, and interpersonal, that systematically benefit whiteness, advantage whiteness, while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color, disadvantages to people of color, especially people of African descent. It is the deepest and most common form of racism. It is the root cause of all other forms of racism. The fact that Black men have the lowest life expectancy of any major demographic group in most European countries is because Black communities usually have less stable housing, poor access to healthcare, and enormous stress and trauma that comes from experiencing everyday racism. All of these factors exist as a result of structural racism. If you look at colorblindness, it makes the argument that only the absence of accounting for race will bring racial equality. We cannot talk about race because that increases racism according to colorblind ideology, and that we must reject all racial categorizations, data collection based on race, and to avoid recognizing the existence of social constructions of race in order to achieve a colorblind society and consequently an equal society. So colorblindness fundamentally is based on the idea that race no longer is an issue. It's not an issue. It shouldn't be spoken about. Colorblindness is extremely resistant to eliminating any categories of race, and therefore any measurements, which makes the whole argument of structural racism completely the opposite to colorblind ideology. The colorblind ideology, as a result, also assumes that racial hierarchies are not operational, and that society is fundamentally fair if it's left alone to its own devices. In other words, we need to continue perpetuating whiteness and all the privileges it comes with. That's how we get equality. The colorblind ideology also rejects policies and programs that are designed to regress a legacy of structural discrimination. For example, anything that looks like affirmative actions, positive discrimination, becomes extremely problematic for the colorblind ideology. As colorblind ideology do not believe that there are any structures impeding us, then it must be the individual behavior of the people who are being discriminated against due to imputed cultural limitations. It is the individual, it is their culture, rather than anything else. So if we live in a colorblind society where a significant number of majority of the population is either unwilling or unable to see the structures that impede racial equality, then how do we convince them otherwise that racism is an impediment, which when there is serious disparities in perception, we have a very huge difference in perceptions when it comes to racism. So the focus on individual behavior and the willful resistance facilitates the rejection of policies and programs that would otherwise do a great deal in countering structural racism. Now, allow me to touch on some of the mainstream challenges to structural racism narrative by the colorblind ideology. They come up with some challenges or some arguments. And the first one is called the structural anomalies. We often hear that the system works, but this is just a one-off. When we see, for example, police brutality, we say, no, the system works. Actually, the police is meant to protect. And therefore, when you have some police brutality or when you have ethnic profiling, stop and search, that is just an anomaly. It is not the norm. And something went wrong this particular time. And this is a problem. What happened is just a procedural mistake we normally hear. It's more of an exception than a rule. Simply a perpetuation of anomalies. That's what the explanation of a colorblind ideology would give. The second one is the one bad apple narrative. We've all heard about the bad apple. You have police brutality, the same police officer or a series of police officers, using their powers disproportionately against Black people. And we always hear that this is just one bad apple. It's not the system. The third explanation is the demonization of the victims or the community, so-called gaslighting. So when Black people are always victimized by authorities, by institutions, are discriminated, it's often the Black person's fault. It's often, you're dressed wrongly, that's why the police stop you. It's because you speak in a loud voice, that's why they stop you. It's because, we thought that you are drug dealers, or Black people normally sell drugs, so that's why it is used as a way to legitimize any kind of violence against Black people. So gaslighting. So these things help in perpetuating and normalizing structural racism and makes it visibly foggy at best. We talk about that data collection, that we need to talk to people that are affected by racism in order to be able to understand. But we have, in many occasions, stressed the importance of collecting comparable and robust disaggregated equality data to document discrimination and tackle structural inequality. But I have to say, data collection alone is not going to interrupt structural racism, because if it was, it probably would have done that already, because the data that we already have is staggering. So people of African descent are seen as being incapable of defining our own experiences with racism and discrimination. Whenever we speak of the impact of race and the racism has in our lives, our experiences are devalued and negated, and we are accused of engaging in identity politics. We are described as people who thrive from self-victimization. We are never perceived as credible witnesses, capable of understanding and describing how the social construct that are construed within our legal systems and institutions and society function and perpetuated. This is what structural racism was meant to do and does very well. The victims of racism have never been perceived as reliable witnesses, not during slavery, not during colonization, and absolutely not in contemporary racist societies. As subjects of racism, we have always been expected to remain silent, but then that's the reason why we need to speak out. We cannot be indifferent or neutral in the face of racism and oppression. When we speak out and we begin to deconstruct key elements like double standards, like structural racism, institutional racism, microaggressions, implicit and explicit biases, thereby exposing how flawed and illogical a colorblind perspective is on racial injustice, then we stand the chance to silence our detractors and change direction. We have to figure out how we can tell the story in a way that builds emotional momentum that the colorblind narrative already succeeded in building. We have to actually try to make people feel emotionally connected to our stories. We have to identify where structural racism happens and condense it in a way that is comprehensible. For example, when we talk about housing, we talk about education, we talk about mass media, public health, employment, criminal justice. These are areas where we know structural racism takes place. But we are made to believe that these areas operate independently and separately in their own spheres. We often look for discrimination in education separately from employment, health, or criminal justice, thereby missing the interconnectedness of all the different areas. So we have to do, what we have to do is that we need to make sure that we put these areas in relation to each other to explain that the system is designed to reproduce these disparities together, interconnectedness. It's not a bad apple, but rather a system of historical and intentional reproduction of disparities through different mechanisms, and that they are interactive and interconnected. They reinforce each other. So it's important to look at them holistically. It is not a single sphere set of problems. It is a series of problems that are interconnected. So ending one is not enough. We have to end them all. Let's have a look at the housing sector, for example, and the policies that create ghettoization, segregation, devaluation of Black and brown communities and their properties, creating high hurdles for any form of journey of wealth creation, professional progression, and the lack of socioeconomic resources resulting in hyper-accumulation of problems, crimes, and poverty in these communities. Landlords, for example, in my own community in Malmö, just a couple of weeks ago, there was an article about this where the landlords in Malmö refrained from giving apartments to Black and brown tenants in areas inhabited by white people, and then vice versa. When white people apply for housing, they make sure that they advise them not to get housing where Black and brown people live. So in these deprived and segregated areas, the lack of investment in schools and therefore the idea that institutions of education is known as the great equalizer fails. Black and brown children growing up in these segregated communities with significantly depleted school system end up with significantly low education outcomes. This, of course, affects or impedes the prospects of young Black and brown people to access the labor market, and therefore the risk of being recruited or getting involved in illegal activities as a means of survival. This creates a tremendous capacity for racialized policing. If you actively segregate people, deprive them of necessary socioeconomic resources, and put them under constant full surveillance, then you risk creating parallel societies with totally different living conditions based on racialization process. Now, policymakers would also use this. They would blame Black and brown people for being lazy, for being segregated, and so on, even though it is the policies that they create that create these conditions. If you look at stop and frisk, only works in a segregated context. Black and brown people in Black neighborhoods are stopped and frisked at a significantly higher rate compared to white people, even though we know through data that Black and brown people can hardly afford, because of the socioeconomic background most of them find themselves, drugs, so compared to white people. But we don't see, white people being stopped and frisked as Black people. The fact that people of African descent continue to face structural racism, discrimination, hate crimes, hate speech, a lack of access to justice, and sustained socioeconomic inequalities in areas such as housing, healthcare, employment, education, which needs to be acknowledged as major barriers to full employment of fundamental rights and key barriers to inclusion and equality, says everything about the disparities in perception between the two parallel societies and the unwillingness, the colorblindness of the people in power who often enjoy privileges of whiteness. That over 14 years after the adoption of the framework decision on racism and xenophobia, several member states have not yet fully and correctly transposed its provision into national law. This is a problem. Now, the question worth asking is Europe better today in practice in its fight against racism than when the anti-racism action plan was adopted? Are Black people or people of African descent lives valued more today than when this plan was adopted? The lack of political will to acknowledge, speak out against, and address the documented and lived experiences of racism has been one of the most significant barriers in achieving equality in Europe today. The lack of acknowledgement of structural and institutional racism, its dimensions, and its historical correlation in political and public debate is a huge problem that we face today. Finally, the cases and patterns of human rights violations and structural racism affecting people of African descent are not given adequate consideration. We need to be aware of that. They're often deflected or ignored, or even when they are reliably attested, it's the same thing. Human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are not European values. They are universal and apply to all, even those that are considered to be coming from what Western media calls uncivilized parts of the world. Or as Joseph Borrell said just a couple of weeks ago, Europe is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle, and the jungle could invade the garden. This is how we are perceived as people of African descent in Europe. What we have been witnessing is a clear and explicit manifestation of the entrenched systemic racism, systemic nature of racism in Europe. It is made possible by the unwillingness to acknowledge, condemn, and change direction by the political elite. So the question again is, why isn't there a political will to change direction? Why do we spread the misconception that certain groups, for example, people of African descent and racialized communities, are incompatible with European societies and values? We've had politicians at the highest level saying this. Like I said, Joseph Borrell was one of those. In a political landscape characterized by the rise of racist and xenophobic movements, like in Sweden, such misconceptions are often instrumentalized and trigger division and further entrench structural racism. This is why civil society organizations and equality bodies like yours, the role that you play is extremely important. A variety of measures are necessary to counter structural racism and Afrophobia. They should aim to improve the economic situation of people of African descent, their level of political representation, their access to employment, justice, and counter discrimination, and access to education and social service. If you are Black, again, if you are Muslim, if you are a woman, if you're a migrant, all these other things together, you get hit hard by this structural racism. And all these measures demand a great deal of political will and the support of all relevant stakeholders. While civil society, Equinet, and equality bodies, as I previously mentioned, have led the way in countering Afrophobia in Europe, legislators and policymakers have a particularly important role to play, and I hope they do. So, ladies and gentlemen, there is no way we can know all there is to know about structural racism. But I hope I'm able to set the scene for a continuous conversation today. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Mamadou, for shedding light on the weight of intersectionality when apprehending racism and discrimination. It really allows us as speakers, hosts, and even the participants, because it's mostly for them that we do this workshop, to see that there are different layers of discrimination: the housing sectors, education, access to employment. And it's very important that you talked about this, and talking about systemic racism and the structural side is very important because it shows the interconnectedness, as you said, of different things and of a system rooted in historical background. So thank you so much for that. It was truly enlightening. Now we will be able to move on, after this wonderful setting the scene, to our second session. The second session will aim to reflect on the expressions of racism and the policy and legal tools that are available to tackle these challenges on a European and international level, with speakers from the UN and the EU. And at the end of the session, we're going to have a Q&A. So again, you can use the chat to ask your questions to our speaker. Our first speaker now is Ms. Michaela Moura. She is the first coordinator of the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan, and she has extensive experience and expertise in anti-racism and non-discrimination policymaking and promoting equality. Indeed, before that, she has worked in non-discrimination ombudsman's office and at the Ministry of Justice in Finland. Sorry. Michaela, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alice, and thank you to Mamadou, the previous speaker. It's always hard to take the floor after you. Thank you really for setting the scene on today's topic. And thank you, of course, Equinet, for having me here today to say a few words from the European Commission's point of view. I hope you can all hear me and see me okay. I'm really honored to participate in this workshop on this extremely important topic. of the role of equality bodies in tackling racism and discrimination against people of African descent, and to address you with just a few words on the EU's fight against racism and anti-Black racism or Afrophobia in particular. I'd also like to thank Equinet for consulting me in the preparation of the workshop, as this workshop actually also plays an important part in the implementation of the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan. So September of this year actually marked the second anniversary of the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan, which was adopted in September of 2020, as it came to be in the aftershock of the murder of George Floyd in the US at the hands of law enforcement. The 2020 summer's Black Lives Matter protests all over Europe really made it clear that EU legislation and policies against racial discrimination need to be more meticulously reviewed. And it's important to mention that even though the power structures of racism function in the same way, the manifestations of racism vary. And this is why the Anti-Racism Action Plan recognizes different forms of racism. And the action plan is actually rooted also in the fight against anti-Black racism. In the EU, the population of people of African descent and Black people is a very diverse group, growing and changing over time. According to some estimates, there are up to 15 million people of African descent living in Europe, made of both established communities of people who've settled in Europe for several generations, as well as recently settled migrants and refugees. There are people of African descent in all EU member states. The findings illustrated in the 2018 focus report by the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights on Being Black in the EU sheds light on the widespread discrimination Africans and people of African descent face in the EU. Overall, it showed that among all groups surveyed, respondents of African descent, together with Roma respondents and respondents from North African background, experienced higher rates of racial discrimination, racial harassment, and violence-motivated hatred, including at the hands of police, which, for instance, were stopped. 1 in 4 respondents of African descent were stopped in the 5 years before the survey. In addition, around a quarter of Black people experienced racial discrimination at work or when looking for work. Especially young Black people were especially vulnerable. And in some countries, up to 76% of people of African descent, of young people of African descent, were not in work, education, or training, compared to only 8% of the general population. Also, housing is another issue, as mentioned by Mamadou earlier. 14% of respondents say private landlords will not rent accommodation to them due to their background. And this is especially problematic when we think about how only 15% of people of African descent, of the surveyed people of African descent, own property, as opposed to 70% of the EU's general population. So these findings really demonstrate how people of African descent, Black people, face structural discrimination in different areas of life. In this case, in employment, education, housing, and law enforcement, but this is, of course, not where it limits to, as so showed by Mamadou. And we also know that structural racism is the most dangerous type of racism due to the silent mechanism in which it operates. Everyday people affected by it can feel its impact in their access to jobs, healthcare, housing, financing, or education, as well as cases of violence. I think, to reflect a little bit on what Mamadou also said in his keynote speech, I think something that is not really discussed or it's not maybe put into words when talking about structural racism, is really the cumulative effects of structural racism and discriminatory practices that affect racialized peoples and people of African descent whole life path, in a sense, where we know that racism starts at a very young age. It affects how youth and children are actually racialized. in school. It can affect their educational paths. It affects your access to the job market, the labor market, how you can actually start building your CV, affects your opportunity to start building wealth. Of course, we know that one important way of start building wealth is to actually own property. But if this opportunity is not given to you, the generational poverty also continues to increase. So I think this is also something that we should talk much more about, is really the cumulative effects of racism. Then when we know also that it can affect indeed your mental health, the effects of racism and discrimination on mental health is also something that is known to be a fact. So it really is something that affects all areas of life, in addition to this cumulative effect on one person's life across their kind of life path. This kind of discrimination that's hidden in laws and services, institutions, and functioning of society that really produces these racialized inequalities almost unnoticeably. Also due to something that Mamadou also mentioned, kind of the unspeakability of race, or these race-neutral policies, which end up actually indeed causing the effect that we're trying to move away from. These apparently neutral policies and practices exclude people belonging to racial or ethnic minorities, and in this case, specifically, people of African descent or Black people. To fully understand the reality of people suffering from discrimination all over the EU and assess their needs and address them effectively, it is crucial to have reliable and comparable equality data. I would disagree a little bit with Mamadou on saying if equality data would fix things, it would have already happened. But in addition, the challenge with equality data currently across the EU is that it's not being done in a harmonized way across the EU member states to really be able to assess the data of equality on the ground, to be then able to build effective policy on top of this. So to this end, the European Commission is really encouraging member states to move towards a harmonized approach on equality data collection, specifically using disaggregated data instead of inefficient proxy information, such as in many countries, it might be related to a birth country of parents or mother tongue of parents, which is not actually necessarily the information we're trying to look for when trying to find information on the state of equality or how people are being discriminated on. So I think definitely equality data should be collected. It should be collected, of course, in a way where data protection legislation is being respected, but it should be done in a more effective way and in a more harmonized way across the EU. About the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan, it's an ambitious policy that consists of comprehensive horizontal and intersectional measures to really step up the fight against racism and discrimination in the EU. Due to the structural nature of racism, it really needs to be tackled at all levels of society. It needs to be addressed in a holistic way and across different policy areas. And here again, I want to mention the importance of data and in how it can really also uncover hidden patterns of discriminatory practices, which in a sense, structural racism is. To this end, the Commission only as recently as last week organized a workshop on structural racism, the first of its kind, to ensure, first of all, that the subject of structural racism stays high on the political agenda, but also to increase understanding around the phenomenon I think this is one of the things that we noticed in when liaising, when working with member states, for instance, is that it's something that has not necessarily been mainstreamed into anti-racism policy work. There's a need to increase understanding around it, defining it more clearly, and finding better ways on how to truly combat structural racism in the member states. So this is what the structural racism workshop we organized last week aims to start, at least. And the final product of this workshop will be a conclusion paper where we aim to start aim to produce a tool for member states to be able to more effectively combat structural racism. As far as legislation, the report on the application of the Racial Equality Directive, which was published in March of 2021, concluded that a closer monitoring by member states on the implementation of the directive is needed, in particular in relation to protection against victimization and the application of effective, proportionate, and dissuasive sanctions. It pointed at the need to raise awareness among those particularly at risk of discrimination about their rights, as well as existing support mechanisms. In addition, the report stressed the need to increase trust in authorities and facilitate access to justice. We know that this is almost like a vicious cycle. Oftentimes communities facing discrimination and it almost becoming a normal part of their existence, where reporting it, would, first of all, it's already mentally challenging to experience discrimination, but then to report it and possibly face re-victimization due to lack of trust in authorities, which leads again to underreporting, even though the fact that reporting would be so important on actually understanding the state of equality again, and the state of the kind of the trends around discrimination, to then be able to build better, more effective policy on top of it. So this is really kind of a vicious cycle, an understandable one, yet not very helpful for ensuring that we have effective policy built on top of that. And here again, national equality bodies are an essential kind of structure that already exists across the EU in ensuring groups facing discrimination, such as in this case, people of African descent and Black people, can enjoy their rights in full and they should be able to effectively perform their tasks assigned to them under EU legislation. However, we know that equality bodies still struggle with different levels of independence, different levels of resources and competencies. And we're currently in the finalizing steps of a legislative initiative. The Commission is in the finalizing steps of a legislative initiative which aims to adopt binding legislation on standards for equality bodies. And these standards would cover, among other things, the equality bodies' mandate, their powers, independence, as well as their resources, to really ensure that the equality body structure, which already exists across the EU, would really be able to ensure that those groups and people vulnerable to discrimination would be able to reach their rights. And this legislation is foreseen to be adopted before the end of the year, actually. Despite the advanced legal framework against discrimination, it appears that legal protection is not enough, and the Commission is therefore combating racism also through policy such as the anti-racism action plan mentioned today, but also the Roma strategic framework, also the strategy on combating anti-Semitism, and in addition to that, also funding programs. In addition, the European Commission facilitates exchanges on diversity management in the field of employment, including through the promotion of diversity charters. And the Commission stands ready to encourage, in this context, initiatives to contribute, gaining better understanding the specific challenges faced by people of African descent in the access to the labor market and at the workplace. And for its implementation, the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan also is committed to strengthening participation of civil society organizations, specifically those working with and for racialized groups. And here, the Commission launched in 2021 a permanent mechanism that meets regularly, at least 4 times a year, to really inform the anti-racism, the implementation of the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan. And in this permanent anti-racism civil society forum, where we also have representatives of communities or people of African descent, as well as the some African diaspora networks. And if there are any civil society listening now online, I would like to just mention that in the spring of next year, we will be launching again a new call for expression of interest on becoming a member of this consultative mechanism. Another important piece of the work is the work on national action plans on racial discrimination with the member states. And here we're supporting member states through a subgroup that has member state experts. Last year, we published common guiding principles to ensure effective national action plans against racism. And currently, we're working on a checklist on the implementation of these common guiding principles, as well as collecting good practices from member states into an online compendium for anybody, available for anybody, I should say. Before I end, I just want to say that as established in the specific objectives in the UN resolution for the International Decade for People of African Descent, that the next speaker, Sarah Hammoud, might highlight a little bit more in her intervention. The European Commission is keen to promote the rights and diverse contribution of people of African descent on the development of EU society. It really is important to support the work of equality bodies, because they can make a difference in people's lives on the ground and other racialized communities of African descent, but also other racialized communities. They fulfill a useful role in issuing recommendations and raising awareness, among other things, on the issue of non-discrimination. I really look forward to hearing more on the fruitful discussions from today. And once again, thank you very much, Equinet, for having me here in this interesting workshop. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Michaela, for explaining the usefulness and the potential opportunities of the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan to address discrimination and racism. It's true that it's a policy tool that can be used by equality bodies to support people victims of racism. We've given them guidelines and being there to support them. So thank you so much for presenting it to us. Our next speaker, as you said, is Sarah Hammoud. She is the coordinator of the Racial Justice Team in the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights. She has over 20 years of experience in the field of international human rights, and she has worked on the promotion, on protecting and promoting human rights in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as preventing sexual exploitation and abuse. Sarah, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here with you. And thanks to Equinet for the invitation and really for continuing to take these discussions forward about the role that equality bodies can play in tackling racism. And I'm honored to come after, Mr. Jallo and Ms. Mua. Thanks so much for all those really informative remarks. And I hope that what I will speak about today will build on what they've said. I think our analysis within the UN is very similar to the analysis that has been presented by both of the previous speakers. So what I wanted to do today was really just to look at some of the the recent work that has been undertaken by OHCHR and by UN bodies more generally, in particular the UN anti-racism human rights mechanisms, and to draw out of that 3 key takeaways. There could be many more, but in terms of the time limit, just 3 key takeaways that might be of particular relevance to the work of equality bodies, and also just to update you on some new mechanisms and processes of relevance to this discussion. So diving right in, I think the first sort of takeaway that we can have from the work that we have done in the UN, but I think very much drawing on the decades of work by civil society as well, and the calls they've been making, I think it echoes what we've heard already, which is that the starting point, our starting point when addressing these issues has to be the systemic nature of racism and the institutions that perpetrate it. And I think there are sort of shifting debates. There is a growing realization or awareness. Hasn't gone far enough yet, but there is some sort of shift in awareness about the need for much more far-reaching strategies and actions, addressing what was raised already about the interconnectedness of these different areas, and realizing that if we don't do that, we aren't going to be able to achieve tangible improvements in what is, entrenched discrimination and inequalities that people of African descent endure, across all areas of life. So there is now a lot of work at the UN level on addressing systemic racism or structural racism or institutional racism. The language that we've been using in OHCHR most recently has been systemic racism, but I think for us it's a kind of umbrella term that captures the structural, the institutional, the societal aspects. So just to give you a couple of recent examples, just this October, the High Commissioner for Human Rights presented a new report calling on states to advance implementation of the agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality, which some of you may be aware we launched last year. That's a 4-point agenda which really pushes for comprehensive evidence-based approaches to address historic injustices as well as their contemporary manifestations that should be grounded in intersectional and intergenerational analyses. And the call that the High Commissioner has made again this year to try and push forward this agenda is to demonstrate, for states to demonstrate greater political will and really to accelerate action, giving a sense of urgency to dealing with these issues. And in the second half of this year, there were also reports by the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, focusing on children of African descent, by the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as another one on climate change, and by the UN Special Rapporteur on health, for example, on the impact of racism on health and the underlying determinants of health. And I think in different ways, each of these reports highlighted structural and historical factors and intersectional dimensions, and provided a sort of push towards really taking more holistic approaches to addressing these issues. So that's the first takeaway. The second takeaway really relates to what's already been raised about data, the need for states to collect and make publicly available comprehensive data disaggregated by race or ethnic origin, as well as by other factors. And there have been a number of recent UN reports that have pushed for advances in this area. But there were 2 recent ones, one by the Secretary General on the implementation of the International Decade for People of African Descent, which was dedicated to this issue, and tried to give a push towards a human rights-based approach to data, and to highlighted ways to address some of the challenges that are faced in some states, including in Europe, in producing this data. Another one that was dedicated to this issue was a report by the recently established International Independent Expert Mechanism to Advance Racial Justice and Equality in the Context of Law Enforcement, which is a mechanism that was set up further to the big report that OHCHR put out, launching that agenda towards transformative change. And their first report, has actually focused on disaggregated data in the context of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. So they've presented this as an essential first step. So not as Mr. Jello said, not necessarily the solution in and of itself, but as an essential first step towards highlighting and addressing the magnitude of systemic racism against Africans and people of African descent, but also linking that to the pervasive linkages with legacies of the past. And just as an example, they conducted their first country visit to Sweden earlier this month, in fact, and during that visit they acknowledged the historical sensitivity around these kinds of around racial classifications that exist in Sweden, but also, as we know elsewhere, as we've heard. But they also made a push to move past that reluctance to collect such data. And I perhaps also to mention that UN reports have also tried to highlight the critical role that equality bodies have been playing to fill the gap when due to this absence of official data in so many countries, through the kind of research that equality bodies do, surveys and other initiatives. And so we've cited a number of those, things like surveys that are funded or undertaken by equality bodies in Germany and France. We've cited, regular reporting on these issues in Spain by the equality body, a project on equality data by the Belgian equality body, which revealed a lack of reliable data on discrimination or racism in the context of police actions. So we try to give visibility to that work as well. So now, maybe the third takeaway relates to confronting the legacies of enslavement, the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and colonialism. And in our 2021 report, that big report that I mentioned, OHCHR set out the elements for a comprehensive approach to repair the legacies of the past through various forms of reparations for the harm suffered. And we see this as also as a fundamental piece for dismantling systemic racism, which we argue persists in part, at least, because states have failed to create those spaces for honest dialogue about these issues and to adequately address the legacies of the past. And it remains the case that we cannot, since in our 2021 report, we concluded that we cannot find a single example of any country with these legacies that's fully reckoned with the past or comprehensively accounted for the impacts of that past on the lives of people of African descent today. And that remains the case. But I would say that we are starting to see some movement in relation to truth-seeking initiatives, to acknowledgement and apologies, to memorialization and other kinds of reparations measures in several countries in Europe. And in our latest report, we do highlight some of those initiatives that have been undertaken just in the past year, such as expressions of regret and apologies, or research into links to enslavement and colonialism, and reflections about what measures should be taken in response to that, and reflections also on the transformation of public spaces. Initiatives that are taken sometimes by authorities, but also by non-state actors, by businesses, by universities, by religious establishments in a number of countries in Europe. From the UN side, the Human Rights Council held a panel discussion in September about the negative impacts of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights. And I think we'll see more on that. A report will be presented next year to the Council, summarizing that discussion. And I think this will be an issue that will stay somehow on the agenda. I think interestingly as well, UN Special Procedures mandate holders are also making the case for addressing past legacies, also in relation to dealing with kind of global challenges, right? So the Special Rapporteur on Racism recently put out a report in which she argued that action to address systemic racism, in particular the historic and contemporary legacies of colonialism and enslavement, is needed in order to resolve the global ecological crisis. The Special Rapporteur on Health highlights the need to redress past legacies and deliver reparatory justice if we're going to realize the right to health. So I think that sort of interconnectedness, the fact that this issue cuts across, you know, all areas, gives also and a need to an impetus to act across all areas. Perhaps I can move now on to some recent developments, which I think are of relevance to the work of the equality bodies in Europe, but also relevance hopefully to this discussion. So there are two new mechanisms that have been established that focus specifically on people of African descent. I mentioned already the International Independent Expert Mechanism to Advance Racial Justice and Equality in the context of law enforcement. And they are, you know, they have to make recommendations. The mandate is to make recommendations on addressing systemic racism in law enforcement and the criminal justice system. And that mandate, you know, they feel also lends itself to certainly engaging with equality bodies, with NHRIs. And they've done that recently in that country visit that they did earlier this month to Sweden, where they engaged with the Equality Ombudsman around the Swedish Anti-Discrimination Act, which doesn't extend to acts committed by law enforcement or criminal justice officials. So, you know, a gap that we as we all know, exists also in other countries. And I think that the legally binding directive that Ms. Moore mentioned earlier is also something that will hopefully start to push this, you know, push the boundaries in this area. So the mechanism highlighted that, and also the kind of strategic cooperation that there might be between equality bodies and NHRIs when they are separate bodies, to be able to really push together on concrete results in this area. The second new mechanism that was established recently is the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. That is something that comes out, you know, of the International Decade of People of African Descent that Ms. Moore mentioned earlier. And that will serve, this body will serve as a consultative mechanism for people of African descent and others, and as a platform for improving the lives and livelihoods of people of African descent, and as an advisory body to the Human Rights Council. There's a lot of energy right now around the first session of the Permanent Forum, which will be held on 5 to 8 December in Geneva. There'll be formal proceedings that can be followed, but there's also a number of side events, and they're focusing this first session on 4 main themes. The first one is around racial discrimination, inequalities, and challenges to sustainable development. The second is around reparatory justice, so, you know, that whole issue of the confronting the legacies of the past. The third one is around equality for all, and the final one is around the draft UN declaration on the promotion and full respect of the human rights of people of African descent. So that brings me to an important process that was.
Interrupt you, Sarah. So sorry, but we are almost running over time. So if you could make a conclusion and wrap up, that would be really kind.
Okay. So I wanted just to mention this UN declaration that is being drafted. There is a process to engage. So we encourage different stakeholders, including equality bodies, civil society organizations who may be here today, to participate in that, and we'll be reaching out. But there's also many other opportunities to engage and to input and to feed feed these processes. Perhaps just to conclude, I think, you know, there's what we try to do in the work that we do as OHCHR, but also we see it in the work of the mechanisms, is very much to amplify the voices of civil society, of equality bodies, of what we're hearing from people of African descent themselves in our reports and in our advocacy and our engagement with states. And we'd also welcome the possibility that equality bodies may see at the national level to lift up the recommendations that are coming out of OHCHR and of the mechanisms, you know, including in relation to the 3 issues that I highlighted today. So, you know, the need for comprehensive approaches if we're to dismantle systemic racism, including the structural and institutional aspects. The using data disaggregated by racial or ethnic origin, as well as lived experiences of people of African descent to drive and assess the effectiveness of legal, policy and programmatic responses. And finally, this need to address the legacies of the past. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for highlighting the work done by the UN OHCHR and the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, and also for explaining how the UN could support equality bodies in such promising actions. Now, we will have a Q&A that will be followed by a coffee break. We have a first question that is mostly directed to all of our speakers. So any of you can answer if you please. So how can people of African descent intervene in the public and political arena and be politically represented, taking into account the complexities arising from processes of differentiation within these communities? So really the question is, how can people of African descent intervene in the public and political arena and be politically represented? Anyone who's willing to take the floor, it's yours. Don't hesitate.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, before I go into answering the question, I would just refer the person, or at least everybody that's listening, to have a look at a report that I've written, which is a charter for non-racist political parties that I have introduced in the Council of Europe and has been voted on. And this charter, basically what it's saying is that, you know, representation is extremely important. And one way, and a significant way, through which people of African descent and other minority groups can be represented is through political parties. And political parties must abide to certain principles that are on this charter. When they sign it, that means that they acknowledge, you know, making sure that they would actively make sure that they have an inclusive political party where, you know, representation would be a mirror of the demography of Europe today. These political parties would also actively acknowledge the fact that they would work on any form of discrimination against these particular groups, these vulnerable groups, and a series of principles that are basically geared towards inclusion, geared towards representation. And this is something that I think wherever you live, and if you're active in a political party or not, you can always encourage these political parties in your own country to sign this charter, and therefore that would be a roadmap as to how to be able to include all different groups in society. That's one thing. The second thing, apart from the charter, I think people of African descent needs to take a stand. And again, as I mentioned in my presentation, when it comes to credibility, we are never perceived as credible witnesses of our own realities. As far as I know, for the past 25 years, I've been talking about racism in almost every arena, national, local, international, and people hear about this, but they don't act. So we need allies. We need people that are allies, that are also privileged people, to speak out not only not for us, but to speak in support of what Black people and people of African descent are saying. We don't have that. I will give just one last example. When I was a member of the European Network Against Racism, a vice chair of INA, so many occasions that I've traveled to Strasbourg to speak on the committee responsible for anti-racism. And I've spoken to them about Black people and the plight of Black people and racism, Afrophobia. And every time I speak, they all agree. But whenever I leave, that's the last time they will speak of that issue. The same thing with the EU. When I was vice chair, we were there talking about people of African descent. But moving from words to action has always been difficult. The only time the Council of Europe decided to write a report and to talk about Black people is when I was from being an activist to a policymaker, to become a politician, and I went to Strasbourg and I sat in the same committee that I used to visit as an activist. Then I said, now I'm sitting around the table where you make decisions. I'm going to push for the rights of Black people. That's the only time that these people started writing a report, that we wrote a report on people of African descent. So representation is important, but it cannot be up to only Black people to speak about our plight. We need to make sure that we have representatives in parliament and in higher institutions that are not Black that can speak also of our plight. And if they don't do that, then we have a right when we vote to make sure that we vote people that will do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mamadou. Does any of you want to also come back on that question, or would you like to move on to another one?
Perhaps I can just take oh, sorry.
You choose. Okay, Sarah, please go.
Okay, I'll be brief. I think I just wanted to mention that this agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality that the office launched last year has as one of its 4 pillars. The third pillar is about ensuring that the voices of people of African descent are heard and their concerns are acted upon. And one of those, one of the elements of that, there are sort of 5 action points within that, and one of those is about ensuring the effective participation and or representation of people of African descent at every level in state institutions, including in law enforcement and criminal justice systems, but across the board, in policy-making processes, in the political arena, and so on. And we highlight the many challenges that people of African descent face, and the exclusion that there is for them in these different processes. But it's really, it is really a fundamental human right, and we try to add our voice to that as well. But also recognizing that in terms of representation, there's work to be done within the UN itself, and I think there is, there's now much greater awareness, and I think energy being put into that to try to make sure that that there's also better representation within UN structures. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I can just add to kind of what Malcolm laid Mamadou laid the big picture. Then Sarah came also to the responsibility of organizations and institutions themselves. And for instance, with the Commission, this is something that also there's a big part of the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan focuses on the diversity and inclusion aspects of the internally in the Commission, and namely really taking a look at the Commission staff and asking the question, do we actually represent people living in Europe? And I mean, we know that the answer is no. Currently, we do not. So how do we actually then move forward from that? We have done it in a very multifaceted way. First, we took data on the situation, not only on actually the state of play of the diversity of the Commission staff, but also how inclusive of a workplace is this. So once you get people that belong to racialized minorities, what is the retention rate? Is this really an inclusive institution to where then also people belonging to racialized minorities have these same opportunities to advance in their career, for instance, as those belonging to the majority population, or what kind of language is being used just around equality? What kind of signals is the institution itself giving about how what this institution is like for those belonging to racialized minorities? Then we're looking also at the actual structures existing in getting talented people into the Commission, etc. So it has to be also done not just from one point of view, and not just to have diverse people in the commission to have them, but have them actually as people that have agency, are in decision-making positions. And then when they say even those uncomfortable things, we should be willing and ready to listen to them and hear them out. So this is, we can't just have diversity to be like a Benetton commercial, like, look, we have one of each color, but actually to ensure that we, on a level playing field, include those people in that environment.
Yes, please, Mamadou, you wanted to react before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I agree 100% with my sister, Michaela. I also wanted to add one last thing, is that we do have a lot of documentation. We do have a lot of data. We do have policies that are saying we need diversity, we need inclusion. We have all that. We have everything written. We don't need to even write even more. Okay, what we need to do is to go from words to action. We need to make sure that what we write about and the policies that we have, that we say we all agree on, we actually practice them in real life. And that's why the problem always has been. We have all these meetings, we have all these seminars, we have all these workshops, we talk about it, we meet all these high-level policymakers, but in real life, when they sit in their offices and it's time to recruit somebody, they decide to choose people that look like them. This is real in every institution, in every country in Europe. That's how it works. And it's so frustrating, and it's so, you know, you as a policymaker, again, I don't call myself a politician. I say I'm an activist in politics. And this just gets to my nerves, because you see this happen over and over and over and over every year for 10, 20, 30 years. You go talk about exactly the same thing. You go to the EU, the corridors there, you see the people that work there. You go to my own parliament, we are 349 members of parliament. It's only 2 Black people in that parliament. And you wonder what's going on. Is it that we are not qualified? That's not true. In the same thing in the corridors in the EU, the same thing corridors of the Council of Europe, I was the only Black person there. It is not acceptable. So we need to move away from talking about it to actually acting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mamadou. So moving on to our next question. It's a 2-in-1 type of question. I think you've all seen it. And so I will read it to you. The question is, what is being done to make sure that equality bodies understand their role to provide a balance of legal power to the targets of discrimination in comparison to the legal power of those with the power to discriminate? And then it says also, is there anything being done about the loser pays rule? Oh, I'm sorry, I misread. No, so the first question about equality bodies understanding their role. I see, Michaela, you would like to answer that question. Please go ahead.
Yes, sorry, I hope I'm not muted, but indeed, so now we're currently working on the legislative initiative that I mentioned earlier on binding standards for equality bodies. So member states are primarily responsible for the enforcement of their national legislation transposing EU law. And the Commission's priority is to ensure that member states transpose this EU law. And for instance, when it comes to the Racial Equality Directive, every if I remember correctly, every 4 or 5 years, we indeed produce a report on the implementation of the Racial Equality Directive that I mentioned also in my intervention on, which was produced March of 2021. But now with the new rules on equality bodies, with this legislative initiative, they will enforce, this will enforce their powers to make sure that the rules are correctly enforced. Even though the text isn't adopted yet, but we plan ambitious proposals so that equality bodies can effectively assist victims also. And as far as the loser pays rule, it's also it's of national competence. So this is the situation with the EU. We don't have competence in relation to the loser pays rule.
Thank you.
And then I think there was something on funding as well.
Go ahead. If you'd
in this new legislation, of course, we'll also plan to include rules on resources for equality bodies. At the EU level, for instance, the Commission funds the Equinet. So this is, I just wanted to add that also in there.
Thank you so much, Michaela. Thank you to all of our speakers. We are moving on to the coffee break. It will last 10 minutes, so please come back at 11:25. Thank you all so much and enjoy your coffee.
cold, acting so tough. Didn't know you had any to be hurt at all. You waited too long. You should have hooked me before I put my raincoat on. Okay, I get it. Okay, I see. You were fronting because you knew you'd find yourself vulnerable around me. Okay, I get it. Okay, I see. You feel vulnerable around me. Hey baby, what's going on? You lost control and you lost your tongue. You lost me, death in my ear. Nothing you can say is gonna change the way I feel. Okay, I get it. Okay, I see. You were fronting because you knew you'd find yourself vulnerable around me. Okay, I get it. Okay, I see. I stepped too close to your boundaries. You wanna nobody around to see. You feel vulnerable around me. Hey baby, what is love? And what's just a game we're both playing and we can't get enough of? We're both playing and we can't get enough of. We're both playing and we can't get enough of.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your coffee and that you are ready for this third session. Okay, so for this third session, speakers from the Fundamental Rights Agency, CSOs, and Equality Bodies will cover the expression of racism and the good practices from Equality Bodies and CSOs. To remind you, at the end of this session, there will be a Q&A again, and you can use the dedicated chat to ask your questions to our speakers. So our first speaker is Ms. Rosalina Lacheva, who's the head of the anti-racism and non-discrimination sector at the Fundamental Rights Agency. She holds a PhD, and her areas of expertise include discrimination, xenophobia, ethnic exclusion, and mixed methods research. Rosalina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us to provide and to give that presentation. I would like now to share my screen, and let me see if you can see my screen. Just a second, that you can follow. So let me check. So, can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, okay. Let me check. I need to go back to the beginning. Okay, thank you once again. So I was asked to quickly give an overview about racism and discrimination against people of African descent, and to showcase a bit of evidence that FRA has done in that area, and also the work that we do not only with collecting data, but also other research that we are compiling in relation to people of African descent, and also other work where we are involved in different subgroups and working groups of the Commission, working with member states and CSOs and equality bodies. So what I would like to do in this presentation is to give a bit of overview about the work related to discrimination and racism at FRA, then to speak a bit about methodology, terminologies, and the challenges that are linked to that, to give a short overview of how we support member states in the collection and use of equality data for people of African descent and their equality, and what could equality bodies do in our view. So first, equality data, of course, makes racism and discrimination visible. It is important to underline that equality data are a crucial element for making structural racism visible and a powerful tool to support the fight against discrimination and exclusion. So equality data enables, on the one hand, to assess the effectiveness of EU and national legal and policy frameworks, to monitor compliance with human rights standards, to monitor trends in equality across different areas of life, to populate indicators to track progress towards meeting EU and international commitments, for example, the SDGs or any other commitments with regard to human and fundamental rights. Then to provide reliable evidence in administrative or judicial cases regarding discrimination and racism through data that point to direct or indirect discrimination, to make visible the hidden figures and highlight evidence gaps. So I think that the speakers before me underlined the importance of equality data several times, and it's also from our side, without data, you can't address and tackle racism and discrimination. So what FRA is doing, and I'm not going to mention all the surveys that FRA had already implemented in you. I think many of you are aware of the number of surveys that FRA has conducted already, but with regard to people of African descent and Black people in Europe, important to mention that FRA has conducted 3 surveys already that directly survey people of African descent. The first was the EU MEDIS 1 in 2008 in all member states. The second was replicated in 2016 in all member states, and in 12 member states we explicitly surveyed people of African descent. And in 2022, we just finished the collection of the data for the 3rd replication of the survey, now called EU Survey on Immigrants and Descendants of Immigrants, which is conducted in 15 member states. And in 13 of these member states, we explicitly cover people from Sub-Saharan Africa and descendants of immigrants from Sub-Saharan Africa, but also, of course, we cover immigrants from North Africa. Apologies, just I wanted to come back to that slide. With what are the outputs in relation to people of African descent? FRA published in 2018 the first ever report of an EU institution on people of on Black people in Europe and people of African descent, the so-called Being Black in the EU report, which analyzes the responses of almost 6,000 immigrants and descendants of immigrants of African descent surveyed in 12 member states, as I mentioned, and you see the countries where we covered that population. Then in 2019, we published a summary of that report in 9 EU languages in the countries where we covered that population. And also data on people of African descent fed extensively in the 2021 opinion on the state of equality in the EU. And I think Michaela already mentioned the report of the Commission on the implementation of the equality directives, and it is FRA opinion in that relation. So we covered among others, strongly the evidence that we have for people of African descent pointing to racism and racialized discrimination. What we are planning, based on the current data sets that we will re-edit Being Black in the EU report, we will have a second edition, and we will publish this report in 2023, towards the end of the year. What this means that it's not only to collect evidence, but we also translate evidence into technical assistance. What this includes is that FRA is member in many commissions, working groups and subgroups, the subgroup on equality data, and also the working group on hate crime reporting, recording, and data collection, and also active member supporting the work of the subgroup on national action plans against racism, which Michaela, as the anti-racism coordinator of the European Union, is coordinating and chairing. So in this regard, we also conduct national workshops, country visits, and peer-to-peer learning. We develop practical guidelines in the area. For example, in 2021, we published a guidance note on the improving the collection and use of equality data based on racial and ethnic origin. And this has been published by the subgroup on equality data and has been developed in cooperation with the subgroup. We also design and implement guidances with regard to the monitoring, designing, and implementation of the national action plans to support the work of the subgroup on NAPA together with the countries. We encourage reporting of hate crime, improving recording of hate crime, and strengthening cooperation with civil society organization. It's written forthcoming, but it is more or less kind of ready guidance note that we've published. Also with regard to putting together all the evidence and research in reports and evidence in different reports, as I mentioned in the slide before. What is also important that promising practices in the different areas that I mentioned are compiled in online compendia that FRA publishes on its webpage, and which can help countries to see different national practices in other national contexts, so that there is an exchange of good practices in this regard as well. What is relevant to mention is that FRA survey results inform EU policies, and that data that we have collected through the different surveys are fed extensively in the different EU equality strategies that have been currently adopted, but also are used to assess or to provide information on midterm evaluation, and also to plan future policies in this regard. So I just listed, I'm not going to go through each of the listed strategies and action plans. But mainly what I would like to underline, going back, that most of the information that FRA collected fed into and informed the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan as the first EU action plan on anti-racism at all. So a few examples from the Being Black in the EU report, and just to sketch quickly that racial discrimination is a commonplace with particular risks for labor market and housing exclusion. Like you see the data that 39% of the people of African descent felt racially discriminated against in the 12 months before the survey. And only 16% of the victims made a complaint about the most recent incident of discrimination. Twice as many respondents with higher education are employed in elementary occupations compared to the general population. The paid work rate among respondents with tertiary education of African descent is lower than that of the general population. 15% own their dwelling compared to 70% of the general population. So all of these are indicators of structural of structural racism, or could be indicators of structural racism. 45% live in overcrowded housing compared to only 17% of the general population. And more than 1 in 2 respondents have a household income below the at risk of poverty thresholds after social transfers in the country where they live. And it is, of course, much higher percentage compared to the general population. Other evidence is related to racism is a common occurrence, including at the hands of the police. Very few report such incidents to any authority or body. And if you look at the different experiences that people of African descent do, that 30% experience racist harassment in the 5 years before the survey, and racist harassment is usually measured by several acts. Yet just 14% reported the most recent incident. 5%, and this is a strong figure here, say that they experienced a racist attack in the same period. That means a racist violence, physical violence, with 11% of those saying that the police officer was the perpetrator. Experiences with racist violence vary, but reach as high as 14%. So it is, compared to how many police officers you have in relation to the population, this is a strong figure. What is also important, sorry for quicking too quickly, that police stops are often experienced as racial profiling, and you see the numbers here. I'm not going into the detail, but many of the people stopped, and it's 41% characterized the stop as a racial profiling. Overall, high trust in the police. So if you look at the level of trust in the police, you have high trust compared to the general population. However, those who have experienced made negative experience with the police, their trust is significantly lower. What is the challenges? I would like to talk a bit on the challenges when we have such data and on terminology. Yeah, tell me, Elise.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we are over time. Could it be possible that you conclude as quick as possible? Thank you.
Yes, there are a few challenges. Very quickly, I will just mention that you have challenges with how to identify the population, how to reach out to the population, how to sample, and how to interpret the evidence that you collect. So you have different sources of error that could pop up, and one needs to take account of those. So I'm not going into the detail how to measure discrimination, what it means, and that you have different concepts which are multidimensional and multi-level, and this impacts, of course, on the way how you interpret, and this has to be taken into account. So I'm not going to look into the different details. What I would like to mention at the end, and to close the session with that, what is the role for the equality bodies? And equality bodies could ensure that first of all, the data that is used to increase racial justice. But to do so, the equality bodies need to be given to be ensured in their broad mandates and allocated adequate human, financial, and technical resources to perform all their statutory tasks effectively and independently. And also, what we suggested in line with guideline number 2 in the guidelines on the improving the collection and use of equality data, which is on the slide if you then use the presentation, that member states should consider enabling equality bodies to foster interinstitutional cooperation in the collection and use of equality data. And this could be only achieved through setting up structures that enable systematic and long-term cooperation between relevant entities. And for that, member states, if they mandate equality bodies to do so, they need to ensure that these are provided with the necessary capacity, expertise, and financial and human resources. So there is a lot where equality bodies could continue to strengthen also the use of secondary data and to get access to such data to use it for their reporting every 4 to 5 years. Thank you and apologies.
No problem. Thank you so much, Rosalina, for introducing to us the work of FRA relating to racism against people of African descent, and for explaining the methodology and terminology necessary to collect data on people of African descent, while shedding the importance of data and also highlighting the challenges. I would like to remind our participants that we will share our speakers' presentation so you have more time to look into it, as we are all aware that they're very interesting. So yes, our next speaker is Miss Annelies de Cat from Belgium's Equality Body Union. She is a policy advisor, and in this role, she has worked on projects like the Diversity Barometer on education and the socioeconomic monitoring. And in 2022, she coordinated the report on the discrimination of people of African descent. Annelies, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alice. I will share my presentation with you. Okay. Is it okay? Can you all see it?
Yes, we can see it perfectly.
Okay, perfect. First of all, let me thank Equinet for the invitation. I'm delighted to be able to present a report to you today. Sorry, 1 second. It doesn't seem to. I'm sorry, I'm having You're still seeing the first slide, I suppose.
Yes.
Yes.
You can see the second. It was working.
I'm sorry. Okay, it's working. Excuse me. So I will present the report very briefly today, not the details of it, of course. And I will pause on 5 things. I will start by talking briefly about the context. Why did we publish this report? Secondly, I will briefly say something about what is in the report, so the contents and the structure. I will present some key findings. And finally, I was asked by Equinet to focus specifically on the obstacles and the successes of the report and on the follow-up of the report. So first, the context. Well, we built on previous reports, a first report on 2001, which was actually the very first time our equality body presented data on people of African descent. And this was actually an analysis of the role of stereotypes in discrimination. And unsurprisingly, the report found that the colonial history of Belgium strongly influenced the perception of people of African descent. And there was a second report in 2017, which was the first time we published an overview of cases of discrimination of people of African descent. So why did we publish a new report now? I think it has been mentioned already by previous speakers. It's hard to overstate the role and the impact of, I think, the Black Lives Matter protests that spread around the globe after the murdering of George Floyd in 2020. In Belgium as well, there were some big protests. This was a huge boost for activism and the public debate. And the public debate in Belgium has been very much focused on demands of activists to reckon with and account for our colonial history. And that's the picture of the statue covered in red paint is actually a picture of King Leopold II, who initiated the in Belgian colonialism, and activists regularly cover statues of the king or representations in red paint or with graffiti to denounce the fact that they're still there. Sorry, I'm going too fast with my, in 2020 in July, a special parliamentary committee on the colonial past was set up. And this is actually quite important. It was initially set up for 1 year, but we're already in the second year of it, and it is due to present its final conclusions in December. It focuses on colonial history, and it aims to be a sort of truth and reconciliation commission, but the focus is not only on the colonial past, but also on the contemporary legacy of colonialism, and racism is a part of that, of course. The commission charged a group of experts to write a report, and it also organized or has been organizing hearings with important experts, with civil society. And that was an important part in our decision, the setting up of this committee to write a report. And slightly older element was the visit of the UN working group of experts on people of African descent in 2019 to Belgium, and report on the findings of this visit. Now, what is in the report? The structure of the report. The first part of the report is an analysis and an overview, actually, of our case files of 11 years. So with data from 2010 to 2022. There's a focus on labor market, on education and housing. And we also present a summary of the existing research and data in those fields, and we discuss a number of hot topics like decolonization, and we have also formulated some specific policy recommendations on these topics. Now, our first key finding. So this is I'll just present two graphs. This first graph is presents the case files we have opened over the past 11 years on racial criteria. Those are the bars in light blue, so the tallest ones actually, and the darker blue bars are the ones with the numbers of the case files per year, in which the case was on a person of Black skin color. The overall number for those 11 years is that 17.4% of our case files on racial criteria are actually involving a person of Black color. The second key finding is, this is, I think, where I will be able to connect with a lot what has been said by the previous speakers. This is on the fields in which these cases of discrimination occur. So again, this is for all racial criteria, and the top three lines are so the most important, the fields for which we have the most cases. These are employment, goods and services. A lot of that is about housing, and then media and the internet. Now, what is interesting is that for Black people, the top three is the same. Oh, I should mention the colors. So the yellow line is the line for employment. The pink line is the line for media. And so the third line, the darker aubergine colored line, is the line on goods and services. So this includes housing. For Black people, the top three is the same. But so it's the same three fields, but the number one field is actually employment. So not media as it is for our general caseload on racial criteria. So I think this is a remarkable difference, which ties in with some of the observations of the other speakers. There's actually in employment, about 1 in 5 is a case involving a Black person. In goods and services, about 1 in 6 involves a case about a Black person, and in cases on media, it's only about 1 in 10 that involves a Black person. I will not discuss the other lines. I mean, I think the top 3 is the most important here. Then, secondly, finding, well, this is that employment is actually a very, very important area of discrimination. We see a lot of cases in it, and what is really interesting is that UNIA has specific data on the labor market, because every 2 years we publish a socioeconomic monitoring. This is a report with data on the labor market. It's basically classic labor market statistics like the employment rate, unemployment rate, but all of this is analyzed according to the origin of workers. So we have really good data on this. And in one of the previous editions, we had a very specific chapter, but every edition of the report has data according to origin. So people of sub-Sahara origin are included in every report, but in one report, we had a very specific a focus chapter on this group. So we have more in-depth data on them. And our overall conclusion is that this is a group that is in a very, very precarious labor market position in Belgium, regardless of their specific national origin. So I'm talking here really of the overall group of people of sub-Saharan origin. In general, they have actually quite a high level of education compared to other groups, and especially the older generation has a high level of education. But very, very strikingly, they have the lowest employment rate. And perhaps one of the most remarkable observations you can make is that in general, on the labor market, we see that a high level of education pays, quite literally. People have a better employment rate, they have better salaries, better stability, etc. But we see that this this is not really the case for this group.
Thank you, Annelies. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you. If you would like to conclude, you can go ahead.
Okay, I will be very, very short. So our third and final key finding that I wanted to present was just that we have like a summary of existing research and data and report, but what is really important is that we want to stress that this is a specific form of racism, and this ties in with the obstacles and successes. Like the big question is how, as equality bodies, I think we're generally used to talking about racism in general, but we're not really used to dealing with specific groups. And there's a huge lack of data and research often on specific groups. But we were very happy to be able to present a report in the Special Parliamentary Committee and to be able to present it also to our network. In follow-up, formulated some policy recommendations. I won't detail them, but I think what is really interesting is that we are now waiting for the conclusions of the Parliamentary Committee and to see what the committee will do with our results that we have presented, and we will move on from there. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Annelies, for showing the key findings and follow-up actions connected to the outcomes of your research. Has been enlightening and very interesting to also explain the experience of an equality body fighting racism against people of African descent. And finally, we will move on to our next and last speaker. Please welcome Ms. Jacqueline Bouzeau, the co-director of the European Network Against Racism. She is a race expert, as she has worked on related projects on race. And doing research for over 10 years on that subject. She also has worked in a race equality think tank. And in addition to her co-director role, she is now a PhD researcher. Ojaku, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisa, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you also, Equinet, just for organising this really important event. For those of you who don't know ENAR, we are an anti-racism network. We have anti-racist organisations across Europe. So I am one of the co-directors, and I've been working at ENAR for many years. One of the projects I've worked on was in fact related to a report on Afrophobia. It was a pan-European report looking at the situation of people of African descent in Europe. And I also worked very closely with Mamadou Diallo years ago on this report and some of the activities he was talking about earlier on. More recently, the work that I've been involved in, specifically regarding people of African descent, was around the UN Anti-Racism Coalition that was established, I think, just over a year ago. And it's an international coalition for civil society organizations, really trying to look at accountability within the United Nations for systemic racism and police violence against Africans and people of African descent. Within this coalition, I and my colleagues have been really working to monitor and contribute and represent European organizations, ENAR members, in the coalition meetings, and support ENAR members to contribute to the input into UN processes. Just recently, I think it was in the month of November, we were liaising with one of our Swedish members and engaged with a stakeholder to try and input into the organised meetings that were created for the UN mechanism when they were visiting Sweden to really look at the racial justice and equality in law enforcement. And in a way, this organisation that we were doing builds on this report that I worked on, where we were documenting human rights abuses from security, private security and law enforcement in Sweden in one of our reports on police brutality. And in this UN coalition, we are also co-organising meetings, contributing to joint press releases, and we coordinated a joint statement at the 49th session of the UN Human Rights Council following the war in Ukraine and the specific treatment of people of African descent in the immediate aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine. So we do a lot of joint advocacy work to kind of develop the implementation of the UN mechanisms from a civil society perspective. And most of this activity, this advocacy work that we're doing, came about in response to Black Lives Matter uprising, which has been mentioned quite a few times already by various panelists. And then I would like to say that policing and law enforcement, whether that's through racial profiling or stop and frisk, or whether that's through police brutality, remains a really important issue for Black communities across Europe. And I would like to point to our report that we published in 2021 called The Sharp Edge of Violence, Police Brutality and Community Resistance of Racialized Groups. And it was a report where we documented police brutality really for the first time. It outlines how racist police brutality and violence is more than just a form of interpersonal violence or racism, but a product of structural racism and a symptom of racial injustice. It highlights incidents from a victim's perspective and includes data from 5 EU member states, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, France, Sweden, and it also analyzes the impact of COVID restrictions. It outlines a range of recommendations directed towards EU institutions, local and national governments, police and law enforcement, and civil society organizations. We really do think that community police relations continue to deteriorate in the context of social protest, which is really important, counterterrorism and stricter migration policies. And we are highlighting the impact of racist policing. So as part of ENA's engagement with institutions and civil society organizations, we have been really well placed to hear the emerging priorities that need to be addressed under more comprehensive strategies that speak to state violence and oppression and across the criminal justice system, and provide solutions beyond legislative frameworks, and incorporate strategies that focus on transformative justice, abolition, and decriminalization. And so we are doing that work in a variety of ways, trying to feed into various mechanisms at an EU and also at a UN level. And one of the things that I wanted to mention is really the developments under Black Lives Matter uprising, which we have seen have shifted positions within the EU, particularly the EU Action Plan Against Racism, which, if you read closely, there is a commitment to assess the lessons that should be drawn from the directive implementation and identify any gaps in the Race Equality Directive. And one of the commitments was that there was to look at specifically the gaps in relation to law enforcement and possibly any new legislation with law enforcement. So this was a really important commitment that we welcomed, and that was a really direct result of the Black Lives Matter uprising. But where are we now, 2+ years on from these uprisings? I can see that there has been some difference in the responses between the EU and international institutions. The UN appears to have dedicated more resources to addressing Black people's demands. For example, ENA, we will soon attend the first session on the Permanent Forum of People of African Descent in Geneva in December. But the really important question is, how much development has there been regarding EU legislation and the commitment in the EU Action Plan Against Racism to review legislation in terms of law enforcement? What we have seen over the recent times this year, that there continues to be a reliance on training and exchanges of good practice on within police institutions, which is much of the same from before. So as Black people in Europe, we are very much in a similar place politically and socially from before the Black Lives Matter uprisings. I would like just quickly to raise a point on intersectionality, because I often speak about this in terms of race and gender perspective, but I also want to mention now that intersectionality also has a part in terms of class and poverty. And I want to raise some significant and contemporary issues in terms of what Black communities are facing today in terms of cost of living crisis. We're still bearing the implications of the COVID, and also discrimination following the Ukraine war. We see our work with equality bodies as a really important, they're an important ally. We hope to construct a strong relationship and we support a strong relationship with equality bodies and civil society. And we look forward to our continued partnership with Equinet and supporting their work, and they often support our work. In terms of what ENAR is doing in the near future, we are thinking of our next annual General Assembly, which will mark 25 years of the European Network Against Racism. We're looking to the future. We're really looking at how we can think more about the future, inspired by the creativity of people of African descent. We need to think more also, move somehow away from always talking about discrimination, and think and look to see how we can think of liberation. And this is really an important thing for people of African descent, Black people in Europe, looking at how we can create spaces for those conversations, for us to think about the future. One of the key work that we are doing at the moment is with a new ENAR fellow who is piloting a new approach to our work with members to help them in the support of development of these new ideas. So in terms of ENAR's work, I'm really excited to invite civil society organizations to come and join us in thinking about the future. And I'm really hopeful that you can share your thoughts and your questions with me today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Urjaku, for your presentation of ENAR's work and for reflecting on the challenges encountered by people of African descent. And it's truly enlightening to hear about promising practices from CSOs, while also hearing your input as what is needed in the future for people of African descent. So now we can move on to our Q&A session again. So all of our speakers, you can turn on your cameras and we have some questions. So the first question that we have is very interesting, and I think each of you could answer to it. So the question is coming from Nefertiti Bikinkita, who's asking, how can equality data collection work when you have EU members, for example, France, who have laws against gathering ethnicity data unless it's under very strict parameters? So if any of you would like to answer, please take the floor.
Okay, maybe I can try to respond. It's not easy, and I think it is first important to bring the people to the same table to discuss. And unfortunately, France is not up to now. At this time is not a member of the Equality Data subgroup, but it could be. It could be in the near future, and to understand how also to bring in their perspective, because during COVID there was a big discussion and a lively discussion also in France with regard to making invisible the specific experiences of people of African descent in access to health, but also simply in ensuring the right to life. So there were different outcomes during the crisis, and I think it was in France they started the discussion how to tackle that problem. So it is, but also important to understand the basic approach of France, why this has been implemented many years ago, this approach, but and to exchange practices. Of course, FRA is collecting data, but using proxies also in France. So you use country of birth and country of birth of parents to come to a kind of to assume that the people behind are making these experiences. Of course, we have several questions to ask if people identify as Black persons or persons of African descent, but this is not enough. It's a limitation, because you can come to first, second generation, but you miss out to cover third, fourth, fifth generations, and it's only a kind of the minimum what our data is showing for experiences that might be out there. So, and this is clearly communicated also from how FRA is tackling that. But nevertheless, at least this is collected, and if you put the limitations, then you can point to the difficulties that arise, and also to the underestimation that such data is providing.
Thank you, Rosalina. Maybe Ojaku, I see you nodding and agreeing with Rosalina. Maybe you'd like to add on to what she said.
Yes, I'm always agreeing with Rosalina. I think also as well, I don't know, Rosalina, I mean, just to say, obviously France is a specific case, but I think there is also a kind of myth. I think it's a myth that we must bust in terms of that collecting data according to race is illegal, and I think that that's not the case when we're talking about equality data collection. That is not illegal, and I think that we should definitely remind everyone about that, and not let different EU member states and governments just put out that myth. It's really unhelpful for our cause, and many people of African descent are collecting this data themselves because they know that it's a way in which to document the problems and to highlight what the possible solutions are. If we don't know what the problem is, how can we develop policies to address it? So yes, that's all I would like to add. And Rosalind, please correct me if I'm wrong here.
No, maybe just to add, I agree fully, and also underline what you just said, Oyako, that we need to pass that message that, and very often to repeat the message that it is not illegal. So if you have the duty to report on equality, and if you have the safeguards that are needed to ensure how to collect and how to use such data, it is possible to do so. And if very often such data is anonymized, and if it's anonymized, not even the GDPR or the General Data Protection Regulation comes into play if you really anonymize the data, but you can use such data for equality reporting. Of course, all these reasons that are brought up to the discussion, that some communities do not agree in collecting such data, that's fine, because if you collect that information, provide, deliver the consent of the people, and it is not the kind, you have to agree to have collected data about your experience and about your background, then it's fine. And there are few, if you have a specific purpose and the goal why that data is collected, and you ensure that there's a safeguard, work together in cooperation, even with the national data protection authorities, this can be done and can be. And I think maybe also to link it to the discussions now, it is important that equality bodies have access to data, because data in some countries has been collected, but very often nobody has access to that data except, for example, the authorities that clearly can use the data. And an independent body like a equality body has to have access to such data, to all the data that is collected in different sources, and use it for independent monitoring and reporting on equality. Not every year, but every 4 to 5 years, to do a kind of a real analysis of equality, using also the cross sections and the intersection, as Oyako mentioned clearly in her input. Yeah.
Thank you so much for answering this question. Before we wrap up, I think, Rosalina, there's a question for you that you can quickly answer to. It's Paul Lapalainen who's asking if FRA considered the use of the situation testing across the EU in order to measure discrimination. So if you'd like to answer that before we wrap up, that'd be great.
Yes, a good question. And FRA was in discussions and I answered, but I think I answered only to Paul privately that we were in discussion with OECD to have a common project on that a few years ago, but at the end we could not ensure a budget for this. And it is, of course, it's one way of collecting experiences of discrimination, how private and public institution might react in such a situation. And it's a strong evidence. It's usually more acknowledged by courts and by institutions. However, it's one possible way, and you need, of course, to do it on a regular basis. But Belgium is very good in that. Yeah, so UNIA, I think they have a good experience with discrimination testing and use it in housing, but also in other areas. But maybe Annelies can add to that. But we are looking into that. It's a good point, and maybe not the next 2 years, but after that, we might try to ensure budget to also implement discrimination testing in cooperation with other institutions.
Yes, Annelies, if you'd like to add to what Rosalina said, because I think it could be interesting, but yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it's true. We have been doing this in different fields. And it has been, so we did pioneer it a bit, but especially in the field of housing, it's really been picked up by authorities, and especially local authorities have started to organize it. And it's always the testing is done by academics. This has been very important in the rolling out of these tests, that it is perceived as scientific and objective and with a very good methodology. Of course, others could do it too, but this has been very important in the public debate. So it's not so easy, and it's been, especially in this one field, it has been a success, and we hope to have similar experiences in other fields, especially in employment. It would be very interesting to be able to have more.
Thank you so much for first of all, for answering all of these questions. And thank you to the participants for asking questions and for being so active during this workshop. Now I will leave the floor to the co-director of Equinet, Tamas Kadach. Thank you.
So again, now with the mic. Thank you very much, Alizé, and thank you to all our speakers today, and of course to all the audience. Thank you very much for being here, giving your presentations, and of course also asking the interesting questions that you did. I would just like to make 6 points of observation by way of wrapping up. One of them is, I think, and I have to start with that, the importance of acknowledging systemic, structural, institutional nature of racism and discrimination against persons of African descent. We heard it, I think, very powerfully that we need to tackle the colorblind policies and the argumentation on bad apples or on any racism being just an anomaly in the system. We do have enough data for this, so we have to overcome this. It was promising that some of our panelists opined that there is now a growing recognition of this systemic character of racism. It was very interesting to hear that it's not only systemic in that it is the society as a system and its institutions discriminating, it is also systemic in affecting all aspects of life, from early childhood to the grave, and as we heard, the effects are cumulative. We heard examples about segregated housing and education, discrimination in seeking employment and at employment, in interactions with the police, in healthcare, including the outrageously low life expectancy. My second point, just to acknowledge that we need to take into account the intersectional forms of racism. And it was mentioned several times also today, mentioning the particularly harmful impact of racism against racialized women on Muslim persons of African descent, for instance. My third point is that we also discussed at length, of course, the importance of equality data. We all agree on the need for it, and we heard the need for overcoming the myth of the impossibility of collecting such data. And while there is still a lot of room for improvement, we already have a lot of powerful data showing the dire situation of persons of African descent due to discrimination in housing, employment, the socioeconomic status and wealth or lack of it, the education, the interactions with law enforcement. So it is surely not, or especially not only the lack of data that can be blamed for the enduring racism against persons of African descent. My fourth point is that we need to make sure that the voices of persons of African descent are heard. On the one hand, from a research and enforcement perspective, we need to build trust and fight underreporting. We need to find better ways to reach out and build links with persons of African descent and their organizations. On the other hand, we also need them in positions of power and agency so that they can have a real influence on how decisions are made in society. And their representation must not be tokenistic. The fifth point I would like to make is about facing the past. We heard about the need for it, facing the effects and the enduring impact of colonialism, slavery and its legacy. No country was found where confronting this legacy would be comprehensive and sufficient. However, again, a growing focus on this, for instance, in the form of truth and reconciliation committees in some countries, in many countries, is encouraging. My sixth and last point is on equality bodies, who, as we heard, can and do fulfill a very useful role, collecting equality data, issuing recommendations, raising awareness and assisting victims in their quest for access to justice, or even using situation testing to prove cases and or to generate scientific data. For this, of course, they need high standards for their mandates, which in many cases, for instance, doesn't include police activities that we heard a lot about today. So that's good to keep in mind. But also standards for their independence, their resources, their powers and accessibility. We hope that the EU legislation on standards will provide many of this, making equality bodies an even more powerful and effective ally. Then they also need to do a lot of work to raise awareness about their services and about the rights persons of African descent have. We hope that this workshop is a good first step in this direction. And while we are finished for today, I have to mention that we would love to welcome you back tomorrow between 10 and 12 for the second day of the workshop, which promises to be equally interesting and with small group discussions also providing more interactivity. So thank you very much once again, and hopefully see most of you or all of you tomorrow.